Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this lantern scene for this year's Lunar New Year, which will be coming next week. I'm going to start off by masking the paper that I have, and I'm going to paint this in a small A6 sketchbook, but you can enlarge the scale if you would like. This is the picture that I'll be referencing from, but I'll try my best to simplify it and translate it into painting. I'm just going to place it as a small thumbnail image on the corner so you can roughly refer back to it. Since the lantern will be the focal point, I just roughly placed it first as I sketch lightly to find the size and the position that I like. Of course, you can move this around as you go and make up your mind along the way. Then for the rest of the elements, I'm just going to roughly sketch out the branches, and for the background, I'm going to paint them freehand. I just try to roughly position them, then redraw the lantern in a more detailed way once I'm happy with the spacing. I'm just taking the basic idea. I don't mind if the form is a little bit different than the reference. I feel like mine is a bit longer, but you can create other lantern designs as well. And for those of you who doesn't want to draw, I'll have the outline available in my coffee shop. Once I'm done with the sketch, I'm going to go over the colors I'll be using for this painting. This is Chinese White by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Vermilion by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, and I'll also be using Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Before I start to paint, I'm going to mask off certain areas, and I'm going to be using the masking fluid by Maurice. Before I begin to paint, I'm going to first mask off the main branches with some flowers that I'm also going to draw freehand with my masking fluid. And for this, I'm going to use my silicone brush to help most of the masking fluid move around with a bit more control. I also find it easier to prepare a big dollop of masking fluid on a scrap piece of paper that I can take little by little with my brush to draw on the small flower petals and flower buds. For me, it's much easier to mask off the branches first, so I can mask the area of the flowers surrounding the main branches, and it's just much easier to visualize this way so I can imagine where the flowers and the flower buds will grow out of. For this, I would definitely recommend using a masking fluid and a silicone brush, which comes to a fine point, especially if you're painting at a small scale like I am. If you are going to paint this in a larger scale, it'll be much easier to paint around the flowers, but you do need to outline them first to know which areas to avoid, and this will also be a bit more tedious to do. As you can see, since the masking fluid is quite liquid, it's not too difficult for me to form the flower petals. I'm sort of just treating this as a painting on its own. Once I'm done, I'm going to mask off the light part of the lantern, and since it's quite large, I used my washi tape to cover the middle, then fill the corners and the rest of the space using my masking fluid. Once I'm done, I want to make sure everything's completely dry before painting on top, and you can tell if they're dry if they change color a bit, and you can see that the color turns darker and a little bit translucent instead of the milky color. Once the masking fluid is completely dry, I'm going to start by dampening the surface of the paper. I'm only going to paint the top part for now, so I'm going to leave the bottom dry. I want to paint the flowers in the background. They're just going to be blurry, so I'm dotting in a medium to thick consistency mixture of titanium gold ochre and a bit of vermilion. Then I'm just going to let them flow on its own. For some areas, I want to add a bit of variation, so I use a thin consistency of vermilion so the color is a bit more pink. I'm looking at the placement in the reference photo, but I'm also making things up as I go, but I do want to leave the top right hand corner empty because I want to add the roof. For this, I used a mix of indigo and burnt umber with a little bit of Quin Red, so the color is dark and a bit purplish. And just like the flower, I'm going to let the color flow around the edges. After that, I'm going to follow this up by just using Ultramarine Finest to paint in between the flowers for the sky. I want to create a slight vignette, so I'm adding the roof color for the top corners of the sky. At this point, I felt like the background was a little bit too dry for the paint to flow on its own, so I just redampened it with clean water before adding on more of the blue for the sky. The roof on the top right is blurring a bit too much for my liking, and I also felt like the color is supposed to be a bit more brown, so I added vermilion to the previous mixture using a medium to thick consistency to repaint it. At this point though, I felt like the paper was a bit too damp, so the paint is flowing out further than I wanted to, so I'm going to leave it for now and add some branches using the same mixture. Then I'm going to use indigo at the bottom, again while the surface is still very much damp, to start painting the roof in the background. You can see that I'm just trying to eyeball this as I go, using a medium consistency first before layering on a bit more detail. I want to take advantage of the damp surface and continue downwards to paint the house or the buildings. I first use a medium consistency of the brown from the color of the roof at the top corner. Then for the frames, I used a mix of indigo and burnt umber to create this really dark gray, or a color that is almost black. For the lantern in the background, I just used the previous brown mixture, but I added more vermilion, so the color is going to be more vibrant. Then I'm just going to roughly eyeball and loosely paint on the background. I'm slowly building with a thicker consistency for the darker areas, especially under the roof, and I also want to start adding on the ridges of the roof tiles. Because the surface is still damp, the paint will spread and dry much lighter than applied, but this will just help with the spacing. I'm sort of treating it like a rough sketch, so I know where to add on the details later as we build on the layers. At this point, I felt like I have enough information to work from, so I'm going to dry it off completely before adding on the next layer. I'm going to paint more or less the same thing. I'm just relayering them with the same colors, but this time I'm painting on a dry surface, so the lines look a bit more defined, but I'm using mostly a medium consistency for the colors, so when it dries, it will dry somewhat translucent and blend more with what I painted in the first layer. This is important because I don't want to lose the blurriness of the background. If you notice, I painted something a bit different on top for the building. That's because I felt like the spacing wasn't quite right. But as you can see, I can correct it by layering on a darker color on top to fix the structure of the building. Try to limit this though, because we don't want the background to look too overworked, but it is possible to still reposition things as you go. For the roof, I want to deepen the ridges, and because I'm painting on a dry surface, you can see that the lines are sharper this time, and I want the vertical lines to be more defined than the curved horizontal sections of the tiles, so I'm just going to use a very light consistency just to add a little bit more of a curvy form for the tiles. I'm not too sure what's actually going on in the background on the left side, so I'm using my reference picture to look at certain shapes instead of objects for the darker values and such, but it doesn't have to make too much sense. After this, I want to go back to paint the sky. I want to darken the color slightly, so I used a mix of Ultramarine Finest with a bit of indigo in a very thin consistency, because I still want the sky to be much lighter than the roof. I'm also using a light load, so as I spread the light blue, I won't wet the paper too much. I'm also going to go back to the roof on the top right corner to extend the placement slightly more to the left, but I don't want to accidentally cover too much area, especially for the flowers in front, so I also dot in some titanium gold ochre in random spots as well. While we're working on the background, I'm going to add some random branches in between the flowers as well, just to fill in a little bit more space before I take off the masking fluid. I feel like I'm pretty happy with the elements in the background that I've placed so far, but this is the time to adjust the values and such before we paint on the flowers and the lantern in the foreground. I'm just going to add a few more flower branches cascading downwards to fill in the space in the background before I dry off everything and take off the masking fluid. I want to work on the flowers and the branches first, so I'm taking that off before I take off the masking fluid on the lantern. Once the white of the paper is revealed, I'm going to start painting on the flowers using a very thin consistency of titanium gold ochre. I know the flowers are supposed to be pink, but I like using titanium gold ochre as a slight underpainting to depict the illumination of light from the lantern. By the way, to paint on the flowers, I switch to my filbert brush, but this is optional. You can also use a round brush. I just prefer the rounded tips for easier and quicker application. I'm also going to use the same color to paint the flower buds. Then I'm going to start adding on the pink while the surface of the flowers are still slightly damp in some areas while others are dry. It's also okay by using a mix of titanium gold ochre with vermilion and quin red. I'm placing the pink mostly at the center of the flowers. Then with a clean damp brush, if the surface is already too dry, I like to soften the edges using a clean damp brush. As for the pink of the flower buds, I like to just place it on the tips. Next, I'm going to add some leaves under the flower buds, the flowers, and also around the branches. For this, I used a mix of titanium gold ochre with a bit of indigo, or you can also use a mix of titanium gold ochre with ultramarine finest. To add a bit more pink, I decided to add some Chinese white into a bit of vermilion and quin red, and I'm going to place it on top of the pink areas of the flowers before using a medium to thick consistency. I've also switched to my small synthetic round brush so I can paint it with a bit more control. Next, I'm going to paint the base layer of the branches using vermilion and burnt umber in a medium consistency, and I just try to place it in the white areas that I've left in between the flowers. The color will look kind of off at the moment because it's too similar to the color of the flowers, but we're going to build on the darker values on top, so there will be a little bit more form. I added more burnt umber here, and I'm placing this on one side, leaving a bit of the base color still showing. For an even darker value, I used the same mix with added indigo. I'm going to place this very thinly on one side again, so you can see it goes from the lighter value to the darker value. This also helps with more contrast with the lighter flowers. Here I'm adding some of the stamens. I'm just dotting it or adding really thin lines. For this, I use the brown mixture from earlier, but I added more vermilion and titanium gold ochre in the mix. I'm only adding the tiny little details to the flowers which are completely opened up, and then I'm going to redefine the petals of the flowers by painting the surrounding sky near some of the petals. I added some of the brown mix to a bit of indigo and ultramarine finest in a very thin consistency. At this point, I felt like I've painted most of the flowers already, so I'm just going to figure out ways to redefine some of the flowers in the foreground to separate them a bit further with the blurry background. Sometimes I like to add a darker value in between the flowers and also use a very thin consistency of the light brown to slightly outline some of the flowers. When you're outlining, make sure you're using a really light consistency, and you also want to paint lightly and thinly. This should be very subtle and not distracting to everything else. I feel like I'm quite satisfied with the flowers for now, so next I'm going to take off the masking fluid and the masking tape on the lantern. Once the paper is completely clean of any masking fluid, I'm going to first dampen the surface lightly using clear water, then I'm going to use titanium gold ochre to paint the round area. I'm starting with the outer part, and then I'm going to use a clean damp brush to pull the paint inwards. It seems like I have accidentally taken too much pigment, so I ended up taking some of them off with tissue. Then again, I'm going to soften the rest of the paint inwards using a clean dry brush this time because the surface is still damp. Then I'm going to use what's left on my brush to dampen the outer part of the lantern, then add more titanium gold ochre to create this blurry light effect. You can also add a bit more water around the edges to spread the paint and make it more blurry around the edges. Then I'm going to dry everything off completely. After this, I'm going to slightly extend the glow using a thin consistency of titanium gold ochre to create more of an orangey color. Just painting it around the outer part of the lantern, then using a clean damp brush to soften the edges. I'm going to keep layering more of the orangey color by slowly adding a bit more vermilion to create a soft radial gradation. Once I'm happy with the saturation of color, I'm going to dry it off completely because next I'm going to work on the darker areas. For this, I'm using a mix of burnt umber and indigo in a thick consistency to create an almost black color. And I'm going to start painting on the details little by little using a light brush load so it's easy to control the paint flow out of my bristles. I'm just roughly following the reference here, but you can also change the design if you would like. For the tassels underneath, I wanted to have a slight red glow, so I used the brown mixture in a thick consistency with a lot of vermilion, but I just ended up going over it again using the black color since I feel like it didn't match with the rest of the design. Once I feel like I have the main structure, I'm going to add the line holding the lantern to the tree branch. I'm also going to add some wiggly lines to represent the wires. For the thin line, you can use a smaller brush and a light to dry brush load to make it easier to paint really thin, delicate lines. You can finish off here, but I really like the lantern design on the reference image. I like that it has some little details, so I'm going to add my own graphic pattern, just some natural design with leaves and flowers, and a mix of burnt umber, indigo, vermilion, and titanium gold ochre. I feel like some parts of the branches need to be a bit darker, so I'm just going over them again using the dark mixture of indigo and burnt umber. Lastly, I'm going to add some final details to balance everything out. Firstly, I'm going to use a fairly opaque mix of bleed-proof white with vermilion and a bit of Quin Red to paint some petals on the flowers, especially if I feel like certain flowers look a bit too dull. I like to also use this opaque mix to outline and clean out some of the edges of the flower petals. I'm also going to add some details to the bottom of the lantern. Here I'm using a mix of bleed-proof white and titanium gold ochre in a dry brush load. Then I'm going to add the details at the bottom. I know this needs to be a bit more subtle, so I would suggest for you to use a thinner consistency compared to what I'm using here. Lastly, I'm going to add some very small dots using the same mixture to represent some dust reflected by the light. I don't know why I find this final touch adds a bit more mysterious and magical feel to this painting, but it's just a personal touch. You don't need to add it in if it's not to your taste. Here I felt like I need to add a bit more warmth and a slightly darker value to the top, so I just used a thick consistency of vermilion and then I softened the blend using a clean damp brush. And that's it. I'm just going to take off the masking tape around the sides to reveal the painting. I really enjoyed this process because I feel like I tried to not overthink and overpaint certain details. Definitely still need to work on it though, but let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!